What's going on? Welcome. I'm gonna jet out this this link real quick. Why does it do that to me? Copy. Put it on Twitter. Get it on out there. Let people know. And here we go. No hashtags. Oh my gosh. I thought that would just autofill, but okay. Else reading time. It is Tweethead. Okay, so, man, this video looks different every time. I eventually might get a better webcam instead of using the one that's just on my computer, but that's okay. It's working, and besides, this is for audio, not visual, which, why I'm using YouTube, that's for me to know and you to guess. Whatever. So last we left off, we were going to start up with chapter 13, which is entitled Interlude, Flesh with Blood Beneath. In the Waystone Inn, let me take care of that because that will make a lot of noise, as I'm sure it usually does. So there's a bunch of buzzes. Let me see where I can put this thing. The ground sounds good. I don't think I'll be able to hear it through the ground, but you know, anyway. Chapter 13, Interlude, Flesh with Blood Beneath. In the Waystone Inn, there was a silence. It surrounded the two men sitting at a table in an otherwise empty room. Kvothe had stopped speaking, and while he seemed to be staring down at his folded hands, in reality, his eyes were far away. When he finally pulled his gaze upward, he seemed almost surprised to find Chronicler sitting across the table, pen poised above his inkwell. Kvothe let out his breath self-consciously and motioned Chronicler to set down his pen. After a moment, Chronicler complied, wiping the nib of the pen on a clean cloth before setting it down. "I would use a drink," Kvothe announced suddenly, as if he were surprised. "I haven't told you many stories lately, and I found myself unreasonably dry." He rose smoothly from the table and began to make his way through the maze of empty tables toward the empty bar. "I can offer you almost anything. Dark ale, pale wine, spiced cider, chocolate, coffee." Chronicler raised an eyebrow. "Chocolate would be wonderful if you have it. I wouldn't expect to find that sort of thing this far from..." He cleared his throat politely. "Well, anywhere." "We have everything here at the Waystone Inn," Kvothe said, making an offhand gesture to the empty room. "Excepting any customers, of course." He brought an earthenware jug up from underneath the bar, then set it on the bar with a hollow sound. He sighed before calling out, "Bast, bring up some cider, would you?" An indistinct reply echoed from a doorway at the back of the room. "Bast," Kvothe chided, seemingly too quiet to be heard. "Shag down here and get it yourself, you hack," the voice shouted out from the basement. "I'm in the middle of something." "Hired help?" Ah, man, what was the voice I just did for Chronicler? Hired, I'll just make it up, whatever. "Hired help?" Chronicler asked. Kvothe leaned his elbows on the bar and smiled indulgently. After a moment, the sound of someone climbing up a set of wooden stairs and a hard-soled boots echoed from the doorway. Bast stepped into the room, muttering under his breath. He was dressed simply, black long-sleeved shirt tucked into his black pants tucked into soft black boots. His face was sharp and delicate, almost beautiful, with striking blue eyes. He carried a jug to the bar, walking with a strange and not unpleasant grace. "One customer," he said reproachfully. "You couldn't get it yourself. You pulled me away from Xellum Tintur. You've been harping on me to read it for nearly a month now." "Bast, do you know what they do to students at the university who eavesdrop on their teachers?" Kvothe asked archly. Bast put a hand on his chest and began to protest his innocence. "Bast?" Kvothe gave him a stern look. Bast closed his mouth and for a moment looked as if he was about to try and offer some explanation. Then his shoulders slumped. "How did you know?" Kvothe chuckled. "You've been avoiding that book for a mortal age. Either you had suddenly become an exceptionally dedicated student, or you were doing something incriminating." "What do they do to students at the university who eavesdrop?" Bast said curiously. "I haven't the slightest idea. I was never caught. I think making you sit and listen to the rest of my story should be punishment enough, but I forget myself," Kvothe said, gesturing to the common room. "We are neglecting our guest." Chronicler seemed anything but bored. As soon as Bast entered the room, Chronicler began to watch him curiously. As the conversation continued, Chronicler's expression had grown by degrees more puzzled and more intent. In fairness, something ought to be said about Bast. At first glance, he looked to be an average, if attractive, young man. But there was something different about him. For instance, he wore soft black leather boots. At least, if you looked at him, that's what you saw. But if you happened to catch a glimpse of him from the corner of your eye, and if he were standing in the right type of shadow, you might see something else entirely. And if you had the right sort of mind, the sort of mind that actually sees what it looks at, you might notice that his eyes were odd. If your mind had the rare talent of not being fooled by its own expectations, you might notice something else about them, something strange and wonderful. Because of this, Chronicler had been staring at Kvoth's young student, trying to decide what was different about him. By the time their conversation was through, Chronicler's gaze would be considered intense at the very least, and rude by most. When Bast finally turned from the bar, Chronicler's eyes widened perceptibly, and the color drained from his already pale face. Chronicler reached inside his shirt and tugged something from around his neck. He set it on the table at arm's length between himself and Bast. All this was done in half a second, and his eyes never left the dark-haired young man at the bar. Chronicler's face was calm as he pressed the metal disc firmly onto the table with his two fingers. "Iron," he said, his voice sounding with strange resonance, as if it were an order to be obeyed. Bast doubled over as if punched in the stomach, baring his teeth and making a noise halfway between a growl and a scream. Moving with an unnatural, sinuous speed, he drew one hand back to the side of his head and tensed himself to spring. It all happened in the time it takes to draw a sharp breath. Still, somehow, Kvoth's long-fingered hand caught Bast's wrist. Unaware or uncaring, Bast leaped toward Chronicler, only to be brought up short, as if Kvoth's hand were a shackle. Bast struggled furiously to free himself, but Kvoth stood behind the bar, arm outstretched, motionless as steel or stone. "Stop!" Kvoth's voice struck the air like a commandment, and the stillness that followed. His words were sharp and angry. "I still have no fighting among my friends. I have lost enough without that." His eyes caught Chronicler. "Undo that, or I will break it." Chronicler paused, shaken, then his mouth moved silently, and with a slight tremor he drew his hand away from the circle of dull metal that lay upon the table. Tension poured out of Bast, and for a moment he hung limply as a rag doll from the wrist Kvoth still held, standing behind the bar. Shakily, Bast managed to find his feet and lean against the bar. Kvoth gave him a long, searching look, then released his wrist. Bast slumped onto the stool without taking his eyes from Chronicler. He moved gingerly, like a man with a tender wound, and he had changed. The eyes that watched Chronicler were still a striking ocean blue, but now they showed themselves to be all one color, like gems or deep forest pools, and his soft leather boots had been replaced with graceful cloven hooves. Kvoth motioned Chronicler forward imperiously, and then turned to grab two thick glasses and a bottle seemingly at random. He set the glasses down as Bast and Chronicler eyed each other uneasily. "Now," Kvoth said angrily, "you've both acted understandably, but that does not by any means mean that either of you has behaved well. So, we might as well start over altogether." He drew a deep breath. "Bast, let me introduce you to Devin Lockhees, also known as Chronicler. By all accounts, a great teller, rememberer, and recorder of stories. In addition, unless I have suddenly lost all my wit, an accomplished member of the Arcanum, at least the Relar, and one of perhaps 20 people in the world who knows the name of Iron. However," Kvoth continued, "in spite of these accolades, he seems to be a bit innocent of the ways of the world, as demonstrated by his plentiful lack of wit in making a near-suicidal attack on what I guess is the first of the folk he has ever had the luck to see." Chronicler stood impassively throughout the introduction, watching Bast as if he were a snake. "Chronicler, I would like you to meet Bastus, son of Remen, Prince of Twilight, and the Telwith Mael. The brightest, which is to say the only, student I've had the misfortune to teach. Glamorer, bartender, and, not last, my friend." I gotta see who's reading this. who, over the course of 150 years of life, not to mention nearly 2 years of my personal tutelage, has managed to avoid learning a few important facts, the first being this. Attacking a member of the Arcanum skilled enough to make a binding of iron is foolish. He attacked me, said Bast hotly. Kvolth looked at him coolly. I didn't say it was unjustified. I said it was foolish. I would have won. Very likely. But you would have been hurt, and he would be hurt or dead. Do you remember that I had introduced him as my guest? Bast was silent. His expression remained belligerent. Now, Kavoth said with a brittle cheerfulness, you've been introduced. Pleased, Bast said icily. Likewise, Chronicler returned. There is no reason for you two to be anything other than friends, Kavoth continued, an edge creeping into his voice. And that is not how friends greet each other. Bast and Chronicler stared at each other. Neither moved. Kavoth's voice grew quiet. If you do not stop this foolishness, you may both leave now. One of you will be left with a slim sliver of a story, and the other can search out a new teacher. If there is one thing I will not abide, it is the folly of a willful pride. Something about the low intensity of Kavoth's voice broke the stare between them, and when they turned to look at him, it seemed that someone very different was standing behind the bar. The jovial innkeeper was gone, and in his place stood someone dark and fierce. He's so young, Chronicler marveled. He can't be more than 25. Why didn't I see it before? He could break me in his hands like a kindling stick. How did I ever mistake him for an innkeeper, even for a moment? Then he saw Kavoth's eyes. They had deepened to a green so dark they were nearly black. This is who I came to see, Chronicler thought to himself. This is the man who counseled kings and walked old roads with nothing but his wit to guide him. This is the man whose name has become both praise and curse at the university. Kavoth stared at Chronicler and Bast in turn. Neither could meet his eye for very long. After an awkward pause, Bast extended his hand. Chronicler hesitated for a bare moment before reaching out quickly, as if he were sticking his hand into a fire. Nothing happened. Both of them seemed moderately surprised. Amazing, isn't it? Kavoth addressed them bitingly. 5 fingers and flesh with blood beneath. One could almost believe that on the other end of that hand lay a person of some sort. Guilt crept into the expression of the two men. They let go of each other's hands. Kavoth poured something from the green bottle into the glasses. This simple gesture changed him. He seemed to fade back into himself, until there was little left of the dark-eyed man who'd stand behind the bar a few moments ago. Chronicler felt a pang of loss as he stared at the innkeeper with one hand hidden in a linen ring. Now, Kavoth pushed the glasses toward them. Take these drinks, sit at that table, and talk. When I come back, I don't want to find either one of you dead or the building on fire. Fair? Bast gave an embarrassed smile as Chronicler picked up the glasses and moved back to the table. Bast followed him and almost sat down before returning to grab the bottle too. Not too much of that, Kavoth cautioned as he stepped into the back room. I don't want you giggling through my story. The two at the table began a tense, halting conversation as Kavoth moved into the kitchen. Several minutes later, he emerged, bringing out cheese and a loaf of dark bread, cold chicken and sausage, butter and honey. They moved to a larger table as Kavoth brought the platter out, bustling about and looking every bit the innkeeper. Chronicler watched him covertly, finding it hard to believe that this man humming to himself and cutting sausage could be the same person who had stood behind the bar just minutes ago, dark-eyed and terrible. As Chronicler gathered his paper and quills, Kavoth studied the angle of the sun through the window, a pensive look on his face. Eventually he turned to Bast. How much did you manage to overhear? Most of it, Reshi, Bast smiled. I have good ears. That's good. We don't have time to backtrack. He drew a deep breath. Let's get back to it then. Brace yourselves. The story takes a turn now. Downward. Darker. Clouds on the horizon. Chapter 14. Oh, titular chapter. Chapter 14 is called The Name of the Wind. Winter is a slow time of year for a traveling troupe, but Abinthy put it to good use and finally got around to teaching me sympathy in earnest. However, as is often the case, especially for children, the anticipation proved much more exciting than the reality. It would be wrong to say that I was disappointed with sympathy, but honestly, I was disappointed. It was not what I expected magic to be. It was useful, there was no denying that. Ben used sympathy to make a light for our shows. Sympathy could start a fire without flint or lift a heavy weight without cumbersome ropes and pulleys. But the first time I'd seen him, Ben had somehow called the wind. That was no mere sympathy. That was storybook magic. That was the secret I wanted more than anything. Spring thaw was well behind us, and the troop was riding through the forest and fields of the Western Commonwealth. I was riding along, as per normal, in the front of Ben's wagon. Summer was just deciding to make itself known again, and everything was green and growing. Things had been quiet for about an hour. Ben was drowsing with the reins held loosely in one hand when the wagon hit a stone and jarred us both out of our respective reveries. Ben pulled himself more upright in his seat and addressed me in a tone I had grown to think of as a "Have I got a puzzle for you?" "How would you bring a kettle of water to a boil?" Looking around, I saw a large boulder by the side of the road. I pointed. "That stone should be warm from sitting in the sun. I'd bind it to the water in the kettle and use the heat in the stone to bring the water to a boil." "Stone to water isn't very efficient," Ben chided me. "Only about 1 part in 15 would end up warming the water." "It would work." "I'll grant you that, but it's sloppy. You can do better, Elir." He then proceeded to shout at Alpha and Beta, a sign that he was in a genuine good mood. They took it as calmly as ever, in spite of the fact that he accused them of things I'm sure no donkey has ever willingly done, especially not Beta, who possessed impeccable moral character. Stopping mid-tirade, he asked, "How would you bring down that bird?" He gestured to a hawk riding the air above a wheat field to the side of the road. "I probably wouldn't. It's done nothing to me." "Hypothetically." "I'm saying that, hypothetically, I wouldn't do it." Ben chuckled. "Point made, Elir. Precisely how wouldn't you do it? Details, please." "I'd get Terran to shoot it down." He nodded thoughtfully. "Good, good. However, it is a matter between you and the bird. That hawk," he gestured indignantly, "has said something uncouth about your mother." "Ah, then my honor demands I defend her good name myself." "Indeed it does." "Do I have a feather?" "No." Telu hold, and I bit off the rest of what I was going to say at his disapproving look. "You never make it easy, do you?" "It's an annoying habit I picked up from a student who was too clever for his own good," he smiled. "What could you do even if you had a feather?" I'd bind it to the bird and lather it with lye soap." Ben furrowed his brow, such as it was. "What kind of binding?" "Chemical, probably second catalytic." A thoughtful pause. "Second catalytic," he scratched at his chin. "To dissolve the oil that makes the feathers smooth?" I nodded. He looked up at the bird. "I've never thought of that," he said with a kind of quiet admiration. I took it as a compliment. "Nevertheless," he looked back to me, "you have no feather. How do you bring it down?" I thought for several minutes, but couldn't think of anything. I decided to try and turn this into a different sort of lesson. "I would," I said casually, "simply call the wind and make it strike the bird from the sky." Ben gave me a calculating look that told me he knew exactly what I was up to. "And how would you do that, Elir?" I sensed he might be ready to finally tell me the secret he had been keeping all through the winter months. At the same time, I was struck with an idea. I drew in a deep breath and spoke the words to bind the air in my lungs to the air outside. I fixed the alar firmly in my mind, put my thumb and forefinger in front of my pursed lips, and blew between them. There was a light puff of wind at my back that tousled my hair and caused the tarpaulin covering the wagon to pull taut for a moment. It might have been nothing more than a coincidence, but nevertheless, I felt an exultant smile overflow from my face. For a second, I did nothing but grin like a maniac at Ben, his face dull with disbelief. Then I felt something squeeze my chest, as if I was deep underwater. I tried to draw a breath, but couldn't. Mildly confused, I kept trying. It felt as if I'd just fallen flat on my back and had the air driven out of me. All in a rush, I realized what I had done. My body exploded into a cold sweat, and I grabbed frantically at Ben's shirt, pointing at my chest, my neck, my open mouth. Ben's face turned from shock to ashen as he looked at me. I realized how still everything was. Not a blade of grass was stirring. Even the sound of the wagon seemed muted, as if far off in the distance. Terror screamed through my mind, drowning out any thought. I began to claw at my throat, ripping my shirt open. My heart thundered through the ringing in my ears. Pain stabbed through my straining chest as I gaped for air. Moving more quickly than I had ever seen before, Ben grabbed me by the tatters of my shirt and sprang from the seat of the wagon. Landing in the grass by the side of the road, he dashed me to the ground with such a force that, if I'd had any air in my lungs, it would have been driven out of me. Tears streaked my face as I thrashed blindly. I knew that I was going to die. My eyes felt hot and red. I raked madly at the earth with hands that were numb and cold as ice. I was aware of someone shouting, but it seemed very far away. Ben kneeled above me, but the sky was getting dim behind me. He seemed almost distracted, as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. Then he looked at me. All I remember were his eyes. They seemed far away and filled with a terrible power, dispassionate and cold. He looked at me. His mouth moved. He called the wind. A leaf in lightning I shook, and the thunderclap was back. The next thing I remember was Ben helping me to my feet. I was dimly aware of the other wagon stopping and curious faces peering at us. My mother came away from our wagon, and Ben met her halfway, chuckling and saying something reassuring. I couldn't make out the words as I was focused on breathing deep, in and out. The other wagons trundled on, and I followed Ben mutely back to his wagon. He made a show of puttering around, checking the cords that held the tarpaulin tight, and I collected my wits and was helping as best as I could when the final wagon and the troop passed us. When I looked up, Ben's eyes were furious. "What were you thinking?" he hissed. "Well, what? What were you thinking?" I'd never seen him like this before, his whole body drawn up into a tight knot of anger. He was shaking with it. He drew back his arm to strike me, then stopped. After a moment, his hand fell to his side. Moving methodically, he checked the last couple of ropes and climbed back onto the wagon. Not knowing what else to do, I followed him. Ben twitched the reins, and Alpha and Beta tugged the wagon into motion. We were last in line now. Ben stared straight ahead. I fingered the torn front of my shirt. It was tensely silent. In hindsight, what I had done was glaringly stupid. When I bound my breath to the air outside, it made it impossible for me to breathe. My lungs weren't strong enough to move that much air. I would have needed a chest like an iron bellows. I would have had as much luck trying to drink a river or lift a mountain. We rode for about 2 hours in an uncomfortable silence. The sun was brushing the tops of the trees when Ben finally drew in a deep breath and let it out in an explosive sigh. He handed me the reins. When I looked back at him, I realized for the first time how old he was. I had always known he was nearing his 3rd score of years, but I'd never seen him look it before. "I lied to your mother back there, Kavoth. She saw the end of what happened and was worried about you." His eyes didn't move from the wagon ahead of ours as he spoke. "I told her we were working on something for a performance, and she's a good woman. She deserves better than lies." We rode on in an endless agony of silence, but it was still a few hours before sunset when I heard voices calling, "Greystone, down the line." They don't say down the line. "Greystone, down the line." The bump of our wagon turning onto the grass jostled Ben from his brooding. He looked around and saw the sun was still in the sky. "Why are we stopping so early? Tree across the road?" "Greystone." I gestured up ahead to the slab of stone that loomed over the tops of the wagons ahead of us. "What?" "Every once in a while we run across one by the road." I gestured again to the greystone peering over the tops of the small trees by the roadside. Like most greystones, it was a crudely hewn rectangle about a dozen feet tall. The wagons gathering around it seemed rather insubstantial compared to the stone's solid presence. "I've heard them called standing stones, but I've seen a lot of them that weren't standing, just lying on their sides. We always stop for the day when we find one, unless we're in a terrible hurry. I stopped, realizing I was babbling. I've known them by a different name. Waystones, Ben said quietly. He looked old and tired. After a moment, he asked, Why do you stop when you find one? We just always do. It's a break from the road. I thought for a moment. I think they're supposed to bring good luck. I wished I had more to say to keep the conversation going. His interest piqued, but I couldn't think of anything else. I suppose they could be at that. Ben guided Alpha and Beta into a spot on the far side of the stone, away from most of the other wagons. Come back for dinner or soon afterward. We need to talk. He turned without looking at me and began to unhitch Alpha from the wagon. I'd never seen Ben in a mood like this before. Worried that I'd ruined things between us, I turned and ran to my parents' wagon. I found my mother sitting in front of a fresh fire, slowly adding twigs to build it up. My father sat behind her, rubbing her neck and shoulders. They both looked up at the sound of me running toward them. Can I eat with Ben tonight? My mother looked up at my father, then back to me. You shouldn't make yourself a nuisance, dear. He invited me. If I go now, I can help him set up for the night. She wiggled her shoulders, and my father started rubbing them again. She smiled at me. Fair enough, but don't keep him up until the wee hours. She smiled at me. Give me a kiss. She held out her arms, and I gave her a hug and a kiss. My father gave me a kiss, too. Let me have your shirt. It'll give me something to do while your mother fixes dinner. He skinned me out of it and then fingered the torn edges. This shirt is holy, more than it has any right to be. I started to stammer out an explanation, but he waved it aside. I know, it was all for the greater good. Try to be more careful, or I'll make you sew it yourself. There's a fresh one in your trunk. Bring me needle and thread and while you're in there, and if you'd be so kind. I made a dash into the back of the wagon and drew on a fresh shirt. While I rummaged around for a needle and thread, I heard my mother singing. In evening when the sun is setting fast, I'll watch for you from high above. The time for you return is long since past, but mine is ever faithful love. My father answered, In evening when the light is dying, my feet at last are homeward turning. The wind is through the willows sighing. Please keep the hearth fire burning. When I came out of the wagon, he had her in a dramatic dip and was giving her a kiss. I set the needle and thread next to my shirt and waited. It seemed like a good kiss. I watched with a calculating eye, dimly aware that at some point in the future I might want to kiss a lady. If I did, I wanted to do a decent job of it. After a moment, my father noticed me and stood my mother back on her feet. That'll be a halfpenny for the show, Master Voyeur, he laughed. What are you still here for, boy? I'll bet you the same halfpenny that a question slowed you down. Why do we stop for the Greystones? Tradition, my boy, he said grandly, throwing his arms wide. And superstition. They are one and the same, anyway. We stop for good luck and because everyone enjoys an unexpected holiday. He paused. I used to know a bit of poem about them. How did it go? Like a draw stone even in our sleep, standing stone by old road is the way, to lead you ever deeper into fay. Lay stone as you lay in hill or dell, Greystone leads to something else. My father stood for a second or two, looking off into space and tugging at his lower lip. Finally, he shook his head. Can't remember the end of that last line. Lord, but I dislike poetry. How can anyone remember words that aren't put to music? His forehead creased with concentration as he mouthed the words silently to himself. What's a drawstone? I asked. It's an old name for loading-stone. Oh, it's an old name for loading-stones, my mother explained. They're pieces of star iron that drew all the other iron toward themselves. I saw one years ago in a curiosity cabinet. She looked up at my father, who was still muttering to himself. We saw the loading-stone in Pellerson, didn't we? What? The question jogged him out of his reverie. Yes, Pellerson. He tugged at his lip again and frowned. Remember this, son. If you forget everything else, a poet is a musician. A poet is a musician who can't sing. Words have to find a man's mind before they can touch his heart, and some men's minds are woeful small targets. Music touches their hearts directly, no matter how small or stubborn the mind of the man who listens. My mother made a slightly unladylike snort. Elitist, you're just getting old. She gave a dramatic sigh. Truly, all the more's the tragedy. The second thing is to go is a man's memory. My father puffed up into an indignant pose, but my mother ignored him and said to me, Besides, the only tradition that keeps troops by the gravestone is laziness. The poem should run like this. Whatever the season that I'm on the road, I look for a reason, loadin' or laystone, to lay down my load. My father had a dark glimmer in his eye as he moved behind her. Old? He spoke in a low voice as he began to rub her shoulders again. Woman, I have a mind to prove you wrong. She smiled a wry smile. Sir, I have a mind to let you. I decided to leave them to their discussion and started to scamper back to Ben's wagon when I heard my father call out behind me. Scales for lunch tomorrow? And the second act of Tim Burton? Okay. I burst into a jog. When I got back to Ben's wagon, he had already unhitched Alpha and Beta and was rubbing them down. I started to set up the fire, surrounding dry leaves with a pyramid of progressively larger twigs and branches. When I was finished, I turned to where Ben sat. More silence. I could almost see him picking out his words as he spoke. How much do you know about your father's new song? The one about the Lanra? I asked. Not much. You know what he's like. No one hears it until it's finished. Not even me. I'm not talking about the song itself, Ben said. The story behind it. Lanra's story. I thought about the dozens of stories I'd heard my father collect over the last year, trying to pick out the common threads. Lanra was a prince, I said, or a king. Someone important. He wanted to be more powerful than anyone else in the world. He sold his soul for power, but then something went wrong, and afterward, I think he went crazy, or he couldn't ever sleep again, or... I stopped when I saw Ben shaking his head. He didn't sell his soul, Ben said. That's just nonsense. He gave a great sigh that seemed to leave him deflated. I'm doing this all wrong. Never mind your father's song. We'll talk about it after he finishes it. Knowing Lanra's story might give you some perspective. Ben took a deep breath and tried again. Suppose you have a thoughtless 6-year-old. What harm can he do? I paused, unsure what sort of answer he wanted. Straightforward would probably be best. Not much. Suppose he's 20 and still thoughtless. How dangerous is he? I decided to stick with the obvious answers. Still not much, but more than before. What if you gave him a sword? Realization started to dawn on me, and I closed my eyes. More, much more. I understand, Ben. Really, I do. Power is okay, and stupidity is usually harmless. Power and stupidity together are dangerous. I never said stupid, Ben corrected me. You are clever, we both know that. But you can be thoughtless. A clever, thoughtless person is one of the most terrifying things there is. Worse, I've been teaching you some dangerous things. Ben looked at the fire I'd laid out, then picked up a leaf, mumbled a few words, and watched a small flame flicker into life into the corner of the twigs and tender, into the center of the twigs and tender. He turned to look at me. You could kill yourself doing something as simple as that. He gave a sickly grin. Or looking for the name of the wind. He started to say something else, then stopped and rubbed his face with his hands. He gave a great sigh that seemed to deflate him. When he took his hands away, his face was tired. How old are you again? 12 next month. He shook his head. It's easy to forget that. You don't act your age. He poked at the fire with a stick. I was 18 when I began at the university, he said. I was 20 before I knew as much as you do now. He stared into the fire. I'm sorry, Kavoth. I need to be alone tonight. I need to do some thinking. I nodded silently. I went to his wagon, gathered tripod and kettle, water and tea. I brought them back and quietly laid them beside Ben. He was still staring into the fire when I turned away. Knowing my parents wouldn't expect me back for a while, I headed into the forest. I had some thinking of my own to do. I owed Ben that much. I wish I could do more. I wished I could do more. It took a full span of days before Ben was his normal, jovial self again, but even then things weren't the same between us. We were still fast friends, but there was something between us, and I could tell he was consciously holding himself apart. Lessons ground to a near standstill. He halted my fledgling study of alchemy, limiting me to chemistry instead. He refused to teach me any sigildry at all, and on top of everything else, he began to ration what little sympathy he thought safe for me. I chafed at the delays, but held my peace, trusting that if I showed myself to be responsible and meticulously careful, he would eventually relax and things would return to normal. We were family, and I knew that any trouble between us would eventually be smoothed over. All I needed was time. Little did I know our time was quickly drawing to an end. Chapter 15, Distractions and Farewells. The town was called Hollowfell. We stopped for a handful of days because there was a good wain right there, and nearly all our wagons needed tending or mending of some sort. While we were waiting, Ben got the offer he couldn't refuse. She was a widow, fairly wealthy, fairly young, and, to my inexperienced eyes, fairly attractive. The official story was that she needed someone to tutor her young son. However, anyone who saw the two of them walking together knew the truth behind the story. She had been the brewer's wife, but he had drowned 2 years ago. She was trying to run the brewery as best she could, but she didn't really have the know-how to do a good job of it. As you can see, I don't think anyone could have built a better snare for Ben if they had tried. Plans were exchanged, and the troops stayed on at Hollowfell for a few extra days. My 12th birthday was moved up and combined with Ben's going away party. To truly understand what it was like, you must realize that nothing is so grand as a troop showing off for one another. Good entertainers try to make each performance seem special, but you need to remember that the show they're putting on for you is the same one they've put on for hundreds of other audiences. Even the most dedicated troops have an occasional lackluster performance, especially when they know they can get away with it. Small towns, rural inns, those places didn't know good entertainment from bad. Your fellow performers did. Think then, how do you entertain the people who have seen your act 1,000 times? You dust off the old tricks. You try out some new ones. You hope for the best. And, of course, the grand failures are as entertaining as the great successes. I remember the evening as a wonderful blur of warm emotion, tinged and bitter. Fiddles, lutes, and drums, everyone played and danced and sang as they wished. I dare say we rivaled any fairy revel you can bring to mind. I got presents. Trip gave me a belt knife with a leather grip, claiming that all boys should have something they can hurt themselves with. Shandy gave me a lovely cloak she had made, scattered with little pockets for a boy's treasures. My parents gave me a lute, a beautiful thing of smooth, dark wood. I had to play a song, of course, and Ben sang with me. I slipped a little on the strings of the unfamiliar instrument, and Ben wandered off looking for notes once or twice, but it was nice. Ben opened a small keg of mead he had been saving for just such an occasion. I remember it tasting the way I felt, sweet and bitter and sullen. Several people had collaborated to write the Ballad of Ben, Brewer Supreme. My father recited it as gravely as if it were the Modegon royal lineage while accompanying himself on a half harp. Everyone laughed until they hurt, and Ben twice as much as everyone else. At some point in the night, my mother swept me up and danced around in the great spinning circle. Her laughter sang out like music trailing in the wind. Her hair and skirt spun around me as she twirled. She smelled comforting, the way only mothers do. That smell and the quick laughing kiss she gave me did more to ease the dull ache of Ben's leaving than all the entertainments combined. Shandy offered to do a special dance for Ben, but only if he came into her tent to see it. I'd never seen Ben blush before, but he did it well. He hesitated, and when he refused, it was obviously about as easy for him as tearing out his own soul. Shandy protested and pouted prettily, saying she'd been practicing it for a long time. Finally, she dragged him into the tent, their disappearance encouraged by a cheer from the entire troop. Trip and Taryn staged a mock sword fight that was one part breathtaking swordplay, one part dramatic soliloquy, provided by Taryn, and one part buffoonery that I'm sure Trip must have invented on the spot. It ranged all over the camp. In the course of the flight, Trip managed to break his sword, hide under a lady's dress, fence with a sausage, and perform such fantastical acrobatics that it's a miracle he didn't seriously injure himself. Although he did split his pants up the back. Dax set himself alight while attempting a spectacular bit of fire breathing and had to be doused. All he suffered was a bit of singed beard and a slightly bruised pride. He recovered quickly under Ben's tender ministrations, a mug of mead, and a reminder that not everyone was cut out to have eyebrows. My parents sang the lay of Sir Savian Tralliard. These names sometimes. My parents sang the lay of Sir Savian Tralliard. Like most of the great songs, Sir Savian was written by Ilian and generally considered to be his crowning work. It's a beautiful song, made more so by the fact that I'd only heard my father perform the whole thing a handful of times before. It's hellishly complex, and my father was probably the only one in the troupe who could do it justice. Though he didn't particularly show it, I know it was taxing even for him. My mother sang the counter-harmony. Her voice was soft and lifting. Even the fire seemed subdued when they took a breath. I felt my heart lift and dive. I wept as much for the glory of two voices so perfectly enmeshed as for the tragedy of the song. Yes, I cried at the end of it. I did then, and I have every time since. Even a reading of the story aloud will bring tears to my eyes. In my opinion, anyone who isn't moved by it is less than a human inside. There was a momentary quiet after they finished, wherein everyone wiped their eyes and blew their noses. Then after a suitable period of recovery had elapsed, someone called out, "Lanra! Lanra!" The shout was taken up by several other people. "Yes, Lanra!" My father gave a wry smile and shook his head. He never performed any part of a song until it was finished. "Come on, Arl," Shandy called out. "You've been stewing it long enough. Let some out of the pot." He showed his head again, and still smiling. "It's not ready yet." He bent down and carefully set his lute into its case. "Let's have a taste of all it, then." It was Taryn this time. "Yeah, for Ben's sake. It's not fair that he should have to hear you mumble over it all this while and not get... Are you wondering what you're doing in that wagon with your wife? If it's not... Sing it, Lanra." Trip quickly organized the whole troop into a great chanting, howling mass that my father managed to withstand for almost a minute before he stooped and lifted his lute back out of the case. Everyone cheered. The crowd hushed as soon as he sat back down. He tuned a string or two, even though he had only just set it down. He flexed his fingers and struck a few soft, experimental notes, then swept into the song so gently that I caught myself listening to it before I even knew it had begun. Then my father's voice spoke over the rise and fall of the music. "Sit and listen all, for I will sing a story wrought and forgotten in a time old and gone, a story of a man, proud Lanra, strong as the spring. Steel of the sword he had at ready hand. Hear how he fought, fell and rose again to fall again, under shadow falling then, loved felled him, love for native land, and love of his wife Lyra, at whose calling some say he rose through doors of death to speak her name as his first born breath." Sorry, I'm really just kind of pulling these melodies out of my, Anyway, my father drew a breath and paused, his mouth open as if he would continue. Then a wide, wicked grin spread across his face, and he bent to tuck his lute safely away. There was an outcry and a great deal of complaining, but everyone knew they had been lucky to hear as much as they had. Someone else struck up a song for dancing, and the protests faded away. My parents danced together, her head on his chest. Both had their eyes closed. They seemed so perfectly content. If you can find someone like that, someone you can hold and close your eyes to the world with, then you're lucky. even if it only lasts for a minute or a day. The image of them gently swaying to the music is how I picture love in my mind, even after all these years. Afterward, Ben danced with my mother, his steps sure and stately. I was struck by how beautiful they looked together. Ben, old, gray, and portly, with his lined face and half-burned eyebrows. My mother, slender, fresh, and bright, pale and smooth-skinned in the firelight. They complemented each other by contrast. I ached knowing I might never see them together again. By this time, the sky was beginning to brighten in the east. Everyone gathered to say their final goodbyes. I can't remember what I said to him before he left. I know it felt woefully inadequate, but I knew he understood. He made me promise not to get myself into any trouble, tinkering with the things he had taught me. He stooped a bit and gave me a hug, then tousled my hair. I didn't even mind. In semi-retaliation, I tried to smooth out his eyebrows, something I'd always wanted to try. His expression was marvelous in its surprise. He gathered me into another hug, then he stepped away. My parents promised to steer the troop back toward the town when we were in the area. All the troopers said they wouldn't need much steering, but even as young as I was, I knew the truth. It would be a great long time before I saw him again. Years. I don't remember starting out that morning, but I do remember trying to sleep and feeling quite alone except for a dull, bittersweet ache. When I awoke later in the afternoon, I found a package resting next to me, wrapped in sackcloth and tied with twine. There was a bright piece of paper with my name fixed to the top, waving in the wind like a little flag. Unwrapping it, I recognized the book's binding. It was Rhetoric and Logic, the book Ben had used to teach me argument. Out of his small library of a dozen books, it was the only one I hadn't read from cover to cover. I hated it. I cracked it open and saw writing on the inside cover. It said, Kavoth, defend yourself well at the university. Make me proud. Remember your father's song. Be wary of folly. Your friend, Abinthy. Ben and I never discussed my attending the university. Of course, I had dreams of going there someday, but they were dreams I hesitated to share with my parents. Attending the university would mean leaving my parents, my troop, everyone and everything I had ever known. Quite frankly, the thought was terrifying. What would it be like to settle in one place, not just for an evening or a span of days, but for months, years? No more performing? No tumbling with Trip or playing the bratty young noble son in 3 pennies for wishing? No more wagons? No one to sing with? I'd never said anything aloud, but Ben would have guessed. I read his inscription again, cried a bit, and promised him that I would do my best. All right, I think I'm going to wrap it up there. So next time we will get to chapter 16, which is entitled Hope. Man, I'm really sad to see that kind of, no pun intended, but that chapter of the book end. I was really excited to see more of what was going to happen between Ben and Kavoth, just to see that relationship develop. Of course, who knows, it might come back around. It doesn't sound like it's going to, but man, that's really, I want to keep reading. But I have something else to do, and I'm very excited about it. I can't talk about it right now, but anyway, if you watched, thank you for joining me. If you're watching in the future, I hope you're enjoying it. Thank you for any comments that you leave, constructive criticism, anything that can help me get better at doing this. Again, I'm doing this as just a self-embetterment project to make myself better at reading, doing character voices and stuff like that. And that's all because I do a podcast with my band called Bombarded, which it's a musical D&D thing. My band gets together, I DM it, they all play bards, they bring their instruments to the table and perform their spells. We roll dice that have chords on them so that we can come up with a song every episode. So if I know there are like love-hate relationships with bards out there, but if you're down to hear some bards jam out some tunes, drop on by. Anywhere you can find podcasts, search Bombarded. It should pop up. If you want to follow us on social media, it's at BombardedCast on any of those platforms. If you want to hear what people are saying about it, check out the hashtag Bardcast. You'll probably see people's opinions. There might be spoilers, so be careful. And you'll also see a lot of really awesome fan art. I love the fan base that we've gotten for that podcast, and they are a fantastic community. And if you haven't checked it out and you stumbled upon this randomly, welcome, and I hope you go check that out too. Other than that, I think I'm going to end it there. Or I don't think I'm going to end it there. I know I'm going to end it there. So catch you next time.